In the mid-18th century, the British Empire stood over the Atlantic world like a colossus, wealthy, disciplined and certain of its own destiny. From London's counting houses to the royal docks at Portsmouth, it appeared that Britain had mastered the mechanics of global commerce. Ships crossed the ocean in endless rhythms, carrying sugar, tobacco, rum and manufactured goods in a cycle that seemed unbreakable. The American colonies fit neatly into this vision, productive, obedient and profitable. At least that was the illusion. Beneath that confident facade, however, the empire was suffocating under the weight of its own ambition. Decades of warfare, especially the brutal and expensive French and Indian War, had swollen the national debt to levels unseen in British history. Interest payments devoured the treasury. Ministers whispered of fiscal collapse. The empire needed money, and it needed it fast. All eyes turned toward the colonies, not as partners but as resources to be squeezed. Across the Atlantic, the Americans sensed a shift they could not yet define. Their prosperity was real, ports buzzing with trade, merchants expanding their fleets, frontier farmers shipping harvests downstream, but it was fragile. Much of their economic success depended on unofficial trade networks buying cheaper goods from French and Dutch islands, selling surplus to Caribbean partners, and quietly ignoring the restrictive navigation acts. It was a system built in the shadows, tolerated for decades, because Britain lacked the capacity or the will to enforce its own rules. But now, with the empire desperate for revenue, those shadows became battlegrounds. British officials moved to tighten control, determined to monopolize colonial commerce. They saw smuggling as theft, autonomy as disobedience, and economic flexibility as a threat to imperial survival. The Americans, in turn, felt the pressure closing around them, prices rising, shipping routes restricted, profits shrinking. The trust that once held the empire together began to crack, quietly at first, then unmistakably. This would not begin as a cry for independence. It began as a fight over trade, over who had the right to profit, to choose partners, to shape their own economic destiny. A secret trade war was forming, slow and silent, waiting for its spark, and beneath the polished calm of the British Empire, something was already going terribly wrong. In the early 18th century, Britain celebrated the American colonies as jewels of productivity, vast land supplying raw materials, bustling ports, feeding the empire's commercial engine, and a growing population that promised an ever-expanding market for British goods. On paper, it was a triumph of mercantilism, the mother country manufacturing finished products, and the colonies providing cheap inputs and loyal consumption. To British ministers, this system showcased stability. To colonial elites, it appeared to offer opportunity. Both sides believed they were benefiting from a harmonious economic order. But beneath this veneer of prosperity lay a structure built on imbalance and exploitation. The Navigation Acts, long considered the backbone of imperial trade, dictated every commercial movement the colonies made, which ships they could use, where they could sell their goods, and which commodities they were allowed to export. These laws were designed not for colonial success, but for metropolitan dominance. The Americans had wealth, yes, but it was tightly leashed. Every crate of tobacco, every barrel of flour, every plank of New England timber existed within a system engineered to enrich London first. Yet for decades that system held because it was selectively enforced. British customs officials accepted bribes, turned a blind eye to smuggling, and often lacked the manpower to police thousands of miles of coastline. This tolerated illegality became the quiet foundation of American prosperity. Merchants thrived not because of British restrictions, but in spite of them, trading with French, Dutch, and Spanish islands, weaving a web of unofficial commerce that kept prices low and markets open. The illusion of stability shattered when Britain emerged from the French and Indian War victorious but nearly bankrupt. War debts towered over Parliament like storm clouds, and the empire's leaders decided that the colonies, flush with land, resources, and productive ports, should shoulder more of the financial burden. To British officials, this was logical. To American traders, it was suffocating. Enforcement tightened, customs patrols multiplied, and suddenly the very activities that sustained colonial economies were treated as criminal betrayals. The empire saw itself restoring order. The colonies saw the rules changing overnight. And, as the pressure mounted, a latent truth became visible. Prosperity built on restriction is never stable. The economic storm was gathering. The trade war was already beginning. The British Empire, staggering under the weight of massive war debt, believed it had found a simple, almost elegant solution: impose new economic controls on the colonies and finally enforce the trade. Regulations that had long existed only on paper. What began as a budgetary fix soon became the empire's fatal mistake. The first strike was the Sugar Act of 1764, a measure intended to curb smuggling by lowering the duty on molasses but drastically tightening enforcement. London assumed merchants would shrug and adjust. Instead, New England's entire shipping economy trembled. Profits evaporated and the quiet tolerated. Networks that had sustained them for decades suddenly became dangerous. Next came the Stamp Act, a tax on paper goods that Parliament believed would be minimally invasive. They thought it was rational, a small levy to help pay for troops stationed in North America, troops the colonists supposedly benefited from. But this was more than a tax. It was a declaration of economic subordination. It signaled that Britain no longer saw the colonies as quasi-partners, but as revenue streams to be tapped at will. Across the Atlantic, printers, lawyers, and merchants watched their costs rise and their autonomy shrink. They felt not protected, but plundered. Then came the Townshend Duties, targeting tea, glass, paper, and paint, everyday goods imported through British channels. Parliament marketed these acts as administrative reforms. In reality, they were economic shackles tightening Britain's grip on every transaction the colonies made. Each measure was rationalized as essential to imperial stability. Each one pushed the colonies closer to revolt. These were not random taxes, they were strategic moves in an escalating trade war, an attempt to force Americans back into the narrow commercial system they had quietly evaded for decades. But instead of restoring control, these decisions ignited fury. Merchants felt cornered, farmers felt exploited, and elites saw in these acts not fiscal necessity but imperial greed. Britain believed it was saving its economy. Instead, it was dismantling its own legitimacy. If you want more hidden stories of economic power, secret deals, and the financial blows that toppled nations, subscribe and let's continue the unraveling. Britain had crossed an invisible line. What it saw as reform, the colonies experienced as economic suffocation. And from that moment forward, resistance transformed from complaint into principle, a principle worth fighting for. The moment Britain tightened its grip on colonial commerce, the consequences spread like fractures through a stressed foundation. The new taxes and trade controls did not simply raise prices, they destabilized the entire economic system that American prosperity had quietly relied on. Merchants who had built their businesses on flexible Atlantic networks suddenly found themselves trapped between imperial law and financial ruin. Ships sat idle in harbors as customs patrols grew more aggressive. Insurance costs soared. Cargoes that once moved freely were seized or delayed, turning profitable ventures into crippling losses. In Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, warehouses filled with unsold goods, British imports now loaded with duties, became too expensive for average consumers, while colonial exporters struggled to find legal markets with reasonable prices. Smuggling, once a calculated risk, became a perilous gamble as the Crown expanded naval patrols and empowered customs commissioners with sweeping authority. Entire communities felt the shock. Sailors lost wages, dock workers lost shifts, and shopkeepers watched customers vanish. The emotional reaction was immediate and explosive. Farmers resented paying more for tools and necessities. Artisans saw their livelihoods squeezed by rising material costs. Merchants, once the quiet beneficiaries of imperial leniency, emerged as some of the loudest critics. Even colonial elites who had long balanced loyalty to Britain with their own business interests felt humiliated by the sudden assertion of parliamentary power. The economic strain revealed something deeper. The colonies had developed their own sense of agency and expectation of economic self-determination that Britain had never intended to grant. Meanwhile, British officials misread the growing unrest. They interpreted petitions, boycotts, and protests as mere tantrums rather than symptoms of systemic collapse. To them, order could be restored through additional oversight. To Americans, every new act of enforcement was proof that the empire no longer understood the realities of colonial life. By the time the first mobs gathered around customs houses, the conflict was no longer about taxes alone. It was about dignity, survival, and the right to participate in the economic world on equal terms. What began as a fiscal dispute had become a struggle over identity and autonomy. The first cracks were no longer cracks. They were widening fissures, splitting the imperial bond that had once seemed unbreakable. As economic pain tightened its hold on the colonies, frustration transformed into coordinated defiance. The boycotts, organized, disciplined, and economically devastating, became the first real weapons in America's silent war against the empire. Merchants, who once hesitated, now joined non-importation agreements, refusing to buy British goods until the taxes were repealed. British exporters, suddenly deprived of one of their most profitable markets, pressured Parliament for relief. The trade war that London had initiated was now shifting in the colonies' favour, powered not by muskets but by empty British ledgers. On the streets, anger hardened into action. Crowds gathered at docks to confront customs officers, symbols of the economic stranglehold imposed by the Crown. The seizure of the merchant ship Liberty in Boston ignited riots that exposed how thin British authority had become. The people no longer feared the imperial machinery. They viewed it as an occupying force interfering with their right to trade, earn, and thrive. Britain responded with troops, red-coated reminders that economic control, when resisted, quickly demanded military reinforcement. The arrival of soldiers did not restore order. It inflamed it. Competition for jobs between soldiers and local laborers created daily tension. Harassment, insults, and street altercations accumulated like kindling. Then in 1770, the tension exploded into violence. The Boston Massacre, though sparked by a chaotic confrontation, the deeper cause pulsed beneath the surface. Years of economic suffocation and resentment that had poisoned relations between colonists and imperial agents. Meanwhile, the Crown doubled down on its control of American sea commerce. The Tea Act of 1773, marketed as a benign cost-saving measure for the British East India Company, was in reality another attempt to force the colonies back into imperial trade channels. Cheap tea was not the issue. Monopoly was. Americans saw the act for what it was, an assertion that Britain could dictate commerce at will. This led to the Boston Tea Party, a dramatic act of economic rebellion. Cargo destroyed not for its value but for the principle it symbolized. The empire viewed these events as sedition. The colonies viewed them as survival. Economics had lit the match. Politics and passion now carried the flame toward full-scale conflict. The breaking point arrived when Britain responded to the Tea Party not with negotiation, but with punishment. The coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, were designed to crush Boston's defiance by suffocating its economy. The port was sealed, trade halted, and thousands were thrust into sudden unemployment. To London, this was a justified correction. To the colonies, it was unmistakable proof that the empire was willing to destroy an entire city's livelihood to preserve its commercial authority. The illusion of shared prosperity had shattered. What remained was naked, imperial power. As economic strangulation spread, solidarity replaced fragmentation. Colonies that had once competed for markets now recognized a shared fate. Merchants in Virginia, farmers in Pennsylvania, shipbuilders in Rhode Island, all saw their futures tied to the fight against Britain's tightening economic chains. The First Continental Congress convened in 1774, not yet demanding independence, but asserting a unified resistance, rooted in one principle. Economic rights were inseparable from political rights. Britain's response was military. If the colonies refused to accept trade regulations and taxes, then force would compel obedience. Troops marched toward Concord in 1775 to seize colonial supplies. Mission meant to break the economic backbone of the resistance. Instead, it triggered the battles of Lexington and Concord, the moment when the trade war erupted into open revolution, war magnified every economic weakness of the empire's position. Suppressing rebellion across an ocean was enormously costly. Each troop deployment, each naval blockade strained the already overstretched British budget. Meanwhile, the colonies, though inexperienced militarily, relied on resourcefulness, local supply networks, and foreign trade, especially with France, to survive. Ironically, the very smuggling routes Britain had tried to eradicate now fed the revolution. By 1776, as the Continental Congress declared independence, the original cause of the crisis was unmistakable. British leaders had attempted to solve a financial problem through forceful control, never realizing that their economic measures had made independence not just desirable, but necessary in the eyes of many colonists. What began as a dispute over taxes and trade evolved into a full-scale collapse of imperial authority in North America. The empire's attempt to tighten its grip had destroyed its grasp entirely. When the cannons finally fell silent and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the British Empire confronted a reality it had never imagined possible. It had lost an entire continent not to a superior army, but to an economic conflict it had ignited itself. The financial consequences were immediate and punishing. The war had drained Britain's treasury even further, deepening the very debt that Parliament had sought to alleviate by taxing the colonies in the first place. Trade, routes that once pulsed with American goods, now fell quiet or were forced to be rebuilt under new, less favorable conditions. The empire retained its global presence, but its aura of invincibility was gone. For the new United States, victory came with its own economic scars. The colonial economy, once interwoven with British commercial systems, found itself abruptly untethered. Ports struggled to reorient their trade patterns. Merchants faced shortages of credit, and states waged their own miniature financial wars through competing currencies and conflicting tariffs. The promise of independence did not immediately translate into prosperity. Instead, the young republic faced years of instability, debt, and fractured commercial structures before forging a unified economic policy. But the deepest, most lasting damage lay in the psychological shift that the conflict created across the Atlantic world. Britain, once confident in the righteousness of mercantilist control, became more cautious in its dealings with other colonies. The empire realized, too late, that economic coercion could fracture loyalty faster than any battlefield defeat. Meanwhile, the American Revolution inspired independence movements globally, planting the idea that economic oppression, monopolies, restrictive trade systems, extractive taxation could justify political separation. Generational wounds formed on both sides. American society developed a suspicion of centralized economic authority that would shape its political culture for centuries. Britain undertook painful introspection, understanding that the collapse of its North American empire was not simply a military failure, but a strategic miscalculation born from financial desperation. The world watched the transformation, an empire humbled, a republic struggling to stand, and a global economic order forever altered. The trade war that Britain intended as a fiscal remedy had permanently reshaped empires, borders, and identities. Neither side would ever return to the world that existed before the crisis began. The story of the American Revolution is often framed as a clash of ideals, liberty versus tyranny, representation against monarchy. But beneath those soaring words lies a far more pragmatic truth. Economics lit the fuse. Britain attempted to solve a financial crisis by tightening control over colonial trade, believing that an empire could be preserved through rules, duties, and enforcement alone. What it failed to understand was that economic pressure does not breed loyalty, it breeds resistance. When people feel their livelihoods constrained, their opportunities closed, their prosperity sacrificed for distant interests, they do not quietly obey, they push back. And if the pressure becomes unbearable, they break away entirely. The British ministers misread the colonies because they misread the nature of power. They believed that economic dependence guaranteed submission, that prosperity within a controlled system would outweigh resentment of that system's constraints. But Americans had built their world on adaptation. trading across borders, forming unofficial networks, and shaping their own commercial destinies. Attempts to narrow that world felt not like management, but like suffocation. The resulting conflict revealed a formidable truth. Economic autonomy is often the first battlefield of political freedom. This lesson echoes far beyond the 18th century. Empires, nations, and governments continued to repeat the same miscalculation, using economic restrictions to control populations or competitors, without considering the political consequences of financial desperation. Sanctions, tariffs, monetary manipulation, and trade blockades can alter behavior, but they can also ignite backlash, radicalize opposition, and accelerate collapse. The British Empire believed it was enforcing order. Instead, it was manufacturing rebellion. In the end, the economic decisions that sparked the American Revolution teach us that stability built on coercion is an illusion. Strength that relies on extraction rather than cooperation corrodes from within. A nation can enforce laws, deploy troops, and project confidence, but if it ignores the economic lives of its people, if it erodes their ability to trade, earn, and pursue prosperity, it risks setting in motion forces far greater than its own authority. The revolution was not merely a political birth, it was the consequence of an empire misunderstanding the true cost of economic control, and in that misunderstanding lies the enduring warning. When money becomes a weapon, collapse is never far behind.